morning and welcome to another edition of Right Now Live. I'm Kellie MacDonald. Tonight's show will focus on church and state issues. The guests will be Reverend Dr. Jay Grote, a youth minister at Riverside Presbyterian Church, Mr. Terry Martin, a youth minister at Clarendon Hills Christian Church, and Mr. Michael Kochvaser, a biology teacher here at RB. Mr. Kochvaser, in a nutshell, what is the theory of evolution?
Well, there are several theories of evolution. The most common is biological evolution, which says that over many millions and even billions of years, life evolved. But evolution per se is the chief unifying factor of all the sciences. There's also the fact that stars evolve, that the chemical elements evolve, and that chemicals evolve from simpler to more complex chemicals over time. So evolution is change over time, but it's more than simply biological evolution, which is usually focused on. There are many types of evolution that are studied in science.
And the theory of evolution is taught at RB?
Yes.
And how long has it been taught here?
Well, I've been here 20 years, and it's certainly been taught those 20 years.
Was anything taught before the theory of evolution?
I think that long before I was here that theory was taught at RB.
There is also another theory of evolution. It's the theory of creation. What is the theory of creation?
Well, the theory of creationism is that God created Adam and Eve, and it's in Genesis, and they had children, and the earth was populated in that form.
I have a question for Mike. Most biblical scholars agree that there are essentially two creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2. Obviously, you're a very learned man in terms of evolution. What does the academic world do with the creation accounts in Genesis? How are they viewed by the academic world?
Inasmuch in science we deal with natural phenomena. And the problem that any scientist has with Genesis or any other creation belief is they involve supernatural phenomena, that is deities, etc. So science doesn't really get involved with the supernatural. Science basically says, are there natural phenomena to account for the way we see life on this planet, and for that matter, the way we see things in the cosmos today. And if they can be explained naturally, scientists simply do not enter into discussions about the supernatural.
I think one of the things, I come in this discussion a lot with my youth group, church. You know, they learn one thing at school and they're being taught something else at church. And one of the things that remains to be seen is the missing link. So I have to remind, that yes, even though creationism is called a theory, it's a belief, something that you put your faith in. Well, so is evolution. It's something that you have to put your faith in because they have no missing link. And, there's no ape-man person yet, so that's something that still I encourage them to investigate to inform their own opinion. And there are some Christians that believe in evolution, that God was the creator of the evolution theory.
That was really the genesis, no pun intended, of my question to Mike, because I represent what traditionally is called the mainline denominations of the Christian faith, and it's really not much of a topic of tension within the church that I serve. I have a sense that maybe Terry's experience is a little different than mine, but we see those wonderful, and that's an understatement, wonderful stories in Genesis as representative of the spiritual realities of life. That's why I was curious, and I have a sense that there are probably, and you can certainly correct me, I have a sense that there's probably a lot of high school teachers that would agree with that sort of recognition of those stories in Genesis.
Well, I would respectfully disagree that there are two theories. I think a lot of people loosely use the word theory as to mean one idea versus another idea. In science, when you use the word theory, that's a very, very powerful statement. A theory is something that there is a very, very high degree of probability for something. There may be people who, as people once did, who still believe that the earth is flat. But there is not a theory of the flat earth. The theory right now is that the earth is relatively spherical. There is not a theory that the earth is in the center of our solar system. That was thrown out with Copernicus, and I might add, after much discussion and problems with the Inquisition and other parts of the church. But those are not two theories. So that in science, when we call something a theory, it's something with a very high degree of probability. I feel that the creation myth in Christianity is a very beautiful story. My own feeling is that it's allegory, it's parable, it is something that we can learn from relative to how to live our lives and so on. But to take it as absolute, and we can go into things that the creation people who like to call it a creation theory, and I would argue it is not, will say that the earth is about 6,000 years old, that it was made in exactly 6 days. On 3 of those days, 3 24-hour periods, it started out with first land plants being made, later with creatures of the oceans and seas being made, and on a later day yet, man and other land creatures were made, and so on. And simply the fossil record doesn't support that the earth is such a short-lived place or that things proceeded in that order. The fossil record is unequivocal that things started a long time ago, and they didn't start with big multicellular organisms the way it's put in Genesis. They started out with microorganisms, which of course weren't even known until Leeuwenhoek invented the microscope.
So how do they always date the bones and the fossils and things that you're talking about?
Well, it's a nice question. There's a variety of ways in which it can be done. You can date things on the basis of radioisotope dating. That's one way. And the other ways that things are dated are called index fossils, that we find similar fossils throughout the world that were laid down in the sediments at a given period in geologic time. And when you find those particular fossils, which were around for that period and then went extinct, you can pretty much date a layer of rock at that particular point. But again, there's not one theory that the Earth is.
I just wanted to know that.
Yeah,
that's great.
it's complex, and what it brings in is that the argument with evolution that some groups have is not simply an argument with biologists. It's an argument with astronomers, it's an argument with physicists, it's an argument with chemists, because evolution is not simply biological evolution. It really involves everything in the cosmos and how it gradually evolved, as best as we can determine through natural phenomena.
There's a few quotes that I wrote down with permission to use
Go
them,
ahead.
Kelly. It's impossible to govern without God in the Bible. That was not Jerry Falwell that said that. That was George Washington. I've always said and always will that the studious personnel of the sacred volume will make us better citizens. And that was not Rush Limbaugh, that was Thomas Jefferson. And the Bible is worth more than all the other books ever printed. And that was not Bill Clinton that said that, that was Patrick Henry. Whoever shall introduce the public affairs, the principle of the primitive Christianity, will change the face of the world. Ben Franklin. Those are a few of the quotes of the leaders and the forefathers of our country. And I think the real discussion here is, should the school be allowed to present both sides of the story? And I think since our forefathers wanted to do that and wanted this country and this nation and their descendants to have that education, I think that it would be fair in arguing that the school should be able to present both sides. To me, education is you hear what the teacher has to say based on the book that you're reading, and you form your own opinion, and that's how you're educated. And I think the present both sides would be very healthy.
The problem I have with that is that there aren't just both sides. And both you gentlemen have seen this beautiful book that I brought here called Alpha Myths of Creation. And I've got well over 50 or 60 creation myths from the Hopi, from the Navajo, from the Maoris in New Zealand. And the point is, they're not just two sides. And if you want to present Christianity's creation myth as one possibility, one must also present all of these. And I would argue that the forum for that would not be in a science classroom, because there aren't theories. You could talk about the different creation myths in an anthropology class or a geography class or whatever, but there aren't simply two sides. There are many sides. And the idea of teaching just these two is really not something I think.
Mike, the myths that you're referring to is not what I'm talking about is creationism, which our forefathers believed in, not all the ones that are in that book. They believed in the Bible, that is probably the largest print book in the world.
I will hasten to add, though, I don't know when those quotes were made, but as soon as they had written the Constitution, etc., they very quickly wrote the Bill of Rights, which very definitely said there should be a separation of church and state. And I would hardly demand to be given time to...
What did that mean, what we're interpreting as it today? No prayer, no creation versus evolution, and I don't want to get into that subject. I know that's coming up, but we're kind of interpreting in the 90s, which what we need to do with what was set back when our forefathers first came.
I think Terry raises an interesting point for me. I'm not familiar with these quotes at all, and I'm sure they are accurate. These are the forefathers, I'll say it, forefathers of the country. Your understanding, Mike, of the legalities of teaching these days, if a history teacher gets up and says Ben Franklin was right, or something like that, is that verboten? I mean, would that person be breaking some sort of law by presenting, here's our forefathers, here were their opinions on God, the Bible? Would that be allowed? For me, that's a larger sense of your question. Would that be permissible to be discussed in a classroom?
Whether or not it's permissible, my guess is if you go around the country, the in-quote laws are broken all the time, that they are brought into the classroom. And I think that generally, fortunately, maybe for all of us, it's simply not brought to litigation and so on in every single in every sense. On the other hand, whenever this has it's worked its way up through lower courts to the higher courts, what you generally have found is the higher courts have simply said, the creation myth, and I will not call it a creation theory, you get into problem, okay, when you want people to take that particular myth or any myth literally, to take them figuratively again as parable, to teach us how to lead our lives, that's one thing. But again, Galileo warned the church a long time ago, and it's even known that when he was arguing that the sun was the center of the solar system, the Inquisition believed it. The problem was they felt they had been telling people for so long that it was an earth-centered Ptolemaic system, that if their flocks knew that they were wrong about one thing, they would then begin to think maybe these guys are wrong about a bunch of things, and they might lose control.
Kelly, what's Ptolemaic mean? Never mind. I agree with you, and I think that Terry and I would probably respectively disagree on this point. There are two, and I will use your word, there are two creation myths in Genesis. Sallustius, a writer in the 4th century, said, myths are things which never happened and always are. And ultimately, that's what I hang my hat on with the creation myths. I do not interpret them literally, but they are the finest account, and I'll say it once again, of the daily spiritual struggle that people go through, people that are interested in the spiritual journey, because they talk about the basic entities, good, evil, also things beyond good and evil, these sorts of things. So I'm going to go out on the limb here and agree with both of you.
Okay. I'm going to say that, just to get my final word in, okay, is that I believe that it's not a myth. I respectfully disagree with that. I believe that it's history, and it's history for me. I wasn't there when Abraham Lincoln got shot, and neither was anyone in this room, and the only way that I know that it's true is that someone wrote it down. And I believe that there's many accounts that correlate with each other, which gives me the faith that I have and the history that I read from the Bible that gives me the creation.
But I think that the distinction is that science is not based on faith. Faith is a beautiful thing.
Science is based on fact.
And it's based on deduction, and it's based on experimentation, and we find certain things out. For example, that women like Kelly are just as good, if not better, moderators than men. Now, that's tough on men. We used to have all these shows. But the idea is that science finds out certain things that are not terribly popular.
I have kids ask me all the time, what if evolution is evolution, then how come apes stop evolving into men? And I can't answer that. Could you?
Yes.
Okay.
But
I need
again,
some wisdom.
I think the big thing that I would say is that right now in the United States, we are not a Christian nation. We are a nation that has mostly Christians in it, all right? But just because the Christians have a stronger lobbying group, all right, than the Maoris or the Hopis or the Cheyenne or the Hindus, doesn't mean that their particular myth should get into the schools whereas the others don't. And if it does get into the schools, all right, it certainly shouldn't get in the science classroom. It should get into a different classroom, again, a cultural geography classroom, along with the other myths, because we are a nation of all religions, all right? And I'm just saying, those who speak strongest for their creation myth are certain fundamentalist Christian groups, not...
well, if it was to be categorized in a myth, then I would still have to say, taking that point of view, then evolution is a myth, because there still is no missing link. And there is ways, the scientific evidence of how you go through of backdating bones and
I would respectfully tell you there are a lot. They just had a long series on PBS with Donald Johanson, and in fact there are all kinds of missing links.
And there's also scientists out there that just believe. I was told in the Wall Street Journal there was an article about how it dates back to there was one woman now they believe in Africa that was the mother of all the children. And I don't know how to explain that. I don't even know how to interpret an article like that, except that science sometimes contradicts itself.
The lady's name, you know, she was an Australopithecine named Lucy,
okay.
Right? And certainly her mitochondrial DNA appears to be in all humans.
Okay.
But once again, there is a very...
Then that could
scientists
make that
argue not about did evolution occur. They argue about how did it occur. Now, when they find all these missing links, the argument is not are they missing links. The argument is where do they fit in? Are they on a line that went extinct, or are they on a direct line to modern day man, Homo sapiens sapiens? That's where the argumentation comes in, not whether or not evolution occurred, but how it occurred.
And I respect your side, and that's great. My view is for the kids, and I wish that they could be able to get both sides of it and come up with their own opinions on what they believe in.
There are 51 sides to it. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well, that's not what our forefathers built it on, those 51 views.
Well, I have a question for Kelly. I don't know if you know or not, but at RB, you know, today, is the Bible studied as, I think a lot of schools say, as literature or something like?
I know it has been in the past. I know it's not now. And we're going to have to take a break right now. We'll return right after this.
It was, I know, just a few years ago, they used to spend a lot.
Do you think creationism should be taught in schools?
No, I really don't, because it's more of a religious thing, and I think it should be religion and school should be separate. And people, if they believe in creationism, then they get taught it at their religious practice.
Do you think they should teach evolution in school?
Evolution, I think, has its place as a theory in teaching in biology classes. It's based on scientific principles, which most of us do agree upon. It follows a scientific method, and there seems to be evidence that support it. So I think it should be part of a biology class.
We're back. Joining us on the second segment is Mr. William Jerkowski, a Social Studies Department Chairman at RB, and Mrs. Jan Goldberg, a Sociology teacher at RB.
Thank you for having us.
You're very welcome. On the second segment, we're going to be talking about court cases that have made it into the news because of their church and state ties. First case I'd like to talk about is Lee versus Weissman, and it's where the court banned adult-instigated religious practices at high school graduation ceremonies. Are there any prayers said at the RB graduations?
Not anymore. This case took place in June of 1992, and that was after RB's graduation that year. So the most recent graduation that this case affected would have been June of '93. And if anyone had attended that, perhaps some of the people in the audience had attended that, they may have been wondering, where are the prayers? How come this is the first time they weren't there? And there was a little postscript posted on the program that said, due to a recent Supreme Court decision, adult instigated prayers are no longer acceptable at high school graduation ceremonies.
Which is not to say that a whole lot of people weren't sitting there praying that they in fact do graduate, or praying that at some point this will be over, or praying that the graduation festivities begin, or what have you. But we're talking about official sanctioned prayer where the school lines up someone to come in and give a prayer, and it's written on the program.
And at RB, for years and years, it was always Reverend Landau. I think for years he was, and it, you know, it was a fairly ecumenical prayer, but a prayer nonetheless. And it always started the ceremonies at RB.
Was there much community reaction when there wasn't any prayers at graduation? And did anybody care?
None that I know of. None that I live in the community. I live in Riverside, and I didn't hear anyone complain. Perhaps they thought, as they should, that RB is bound by the U.S. Supreme Court, as we all are.
Yeah.
And we didn't survey people to say, is something
like
missing?
Well, that's a natural question for people
Right.
of my ilk. And I had a sense that there probably wasn't much reaction.
No, I didn't hear. I made it for maybe a 5-minute shorter ceremony.
They may not have known it until after the fact. It may not have.
I thought it was interesting that they put it in the program underneath, the situations that were going to occur, who was speaking when, and they put it there, this is why, as an explanation. I wonder if they'll have it this year. Maybe they think that once is enough as a precedent setter.
Was there any group that pushed for this ban of prayer?
A group?
Like a religious group or anyone who said, we don't want this to the Supreme Court?
Well, it arose out of a case in Providence, Rhode Island. And a particular individual did not want his daughter subjected. I think it was a middle school, not a high school. We would call it junior high. And I believe this man was an atheist, and he did not want his daughter to have to sit through that, against her will. And she had to attend the ceremony. That was part of the school obligations. I didn't think they were going to mail her a diploma, or there was peer pressure to accept the diploma in person. So the case was Lee versus Weissman, and Mr. Weissman, if you want to call him a group, he pushed for it. I don't know if the ACLU was involved in that particular one or not, but he probably had help from civil libertarian type lawyers who used the First Amendment and won.
Bill, in a wonderfully humorous way, a few minutes ago raised an issue for me. I have a question. Did the actual case that we're talking about, did it say formal prayer? I think that's what Kelly said,
Yes.
but I don't. Well, the reason
Yes.
why I asked the question is, as a pastor, sometimes people will ask me, how do you feel about that? You can't pray in school, and maybe I'm going to go to, where for this. But my initial response usually is one of, I kind of want to laugh, because. And then I think, no, I shouldn't laugh. And the reason why I want to laugh is because prayer is not just getting on your knees, by your bed at night all alone. And I always come up with the illustration, and I ask the person, hopefully with humor, can you chew gum and ride a bike at the same time? And most people are able to. Most people say yes. Well, then you can pray. And speaking as a pastor, you can pray right now if you want to. I mean, the human mind and the human spirit is incredibly capable of praying all day. And in fact, that's what the Apostle Paul said that we should do. And so I have to say, as a pastor in the community, the issue is not one that I lose much sleep over. Although I do wish that there were formal prayers in the school.
With the exception of the apostle part of the story, when we discussed this in my government class, that's exactly what I say, that the Supreme Court rulings about prayer in school were formal, a teacher representing the state, if you will. School children, and the rulings have been different for college students than they have for high school and grade school students, that they would be more impressionable, and that formally we, the state, cannot institute prayer, which is not to say that they cannot be praying the entire time from the time they set foot in the building to the time they leave, over a variety of things, one being that this class end. So,
that would never happen in your class.
But it's an example I use, so we've got agreement on that. On that
It's
point.
formal prayer, and there is peer pressure. If a particular minister of a particular faith is using language of that faith, people in the audience who are not of that faith are going to feel at least slightly uncomfortable. I mean, they may stand there and be respectfully silent, but I'm sure you've been in other denominations where you don't know the prayers by heart and that sort of thing. You feel uncomfortable, and I think that's what we're trying to say. As a state-sponsored institution, no one should feel uncomfortable, especially at graduation ceremonies.
In another case, the West Side Community Schools versus Mergens, the Supreme Court requires schools to allow religious clubs to meet on the school grounds if there are other extracurricular clubs that are unrelated to the curriculum. Are there any such clubs here at RB?
Religious clubs or clubs unrelated to the curriculum?
Religious clubs.
Yeah, there's plenty of clubs unrelated. None that I'm aware of. Mr. J, I don't think so.
We used to have a chapter of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, but I don't think that's active anymore.
Occasionally, in my current events club, I have a club called the Forum Club. We talk about all kinds of controversial issues, and religion might play a part in one of those issues, but I would hardly call it a religious club. If anything, it's a political issues club. But no such clubs exist. But in that particular case, a girl wanted a Bible study club to meet on school grounds after school, and her principal had denied her the access to the school building based on the First Amendment, and she took it to the Supreme Court and won because, other clubs such as Tea Club or Fishing Club that have nothing to do with anything being taught have access, so why can't she?
Kelly, is it okay if I have a commercial for a second? If there's anybody out there who is interested in starting a Fellowship of Christian Athletes or restarting it at RB, I know I would be interested in doing that.
And how would someone go about forming this club? Does it have to have faculty or approval?
There is a set of procedures for forming clubs, any new club, which would be writing a constitution, trying to find a sponsor,
faculty,
and submitting that to the administration for approval. So there is a set of guidelines for forming any new club.
So there would have to be a faculty sponsor as well as, say, a community member?
I'm not sure on that.
I think
on
at
that
least
detail.
someone connected with the high school.
Oh, there
Maybe
should
not
be.
a teacher, a teacher's aide, someone who is connected with the high school would have to
supervise.
sponsor, be a sponsor,
Right.
or to write the Constitution, if nothing else, for the club and to write the guidelines and the rules.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank our guests, the audience, and the television viewers for taking part in tonight's show. I'm Kellie MacDonald. Our next show will air on May 23rd. Thank you for watching.